Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to share our lecture regarding Chapter 18 of your course textbook. This will do two things. It will wrap up our unit on professional and technical communication, in addition to inaugurating us into our final unit or module on persuasive speaking. So, let's dive right in. We're going to start with a quiz, and that quiz is going to be about whether or not you consider yourself to be a persuasive person. Now, all of the questions I'm about to ask actually came from Hidden Dimension, which is a business and professional communication publication. Question number 1. If you want someone to do you a big favor, you should remind them of everything you've done for them. So, should you? Especially if you've invested a lot of time and effort into someone's well-being, shouldn't they be reminded of that fact? Well, the answer is no. It turns out most people will respond negatively if you do ask them to perform based upon your prior performance. In fact, a better way to get someone's assistance is to say that they are the only person that can help you, and that they're the best candidate for that level of assistance. In other words, the "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope" measure tends to be the most effective way to persuade someone to assist you. Question 2. Should you set impossible deadlines if you want an employee to work harder? In other words, if you really want someone to break outside of their comfort zone, should you set almost impossible tasks for them so that they'll really be forced to broaden their horizons? Again, the answer is no. That's a lousy idea. And the reason is because invariably this causes your employees to do one of two things. They'll either quit when they realize the deck, proverbially speaking, is stacked against them, or they'll cheat, such as in the instance of the recent debacle related to the Volkswagen. The Volkswagen had to get their EPA standards to a certain height, and so they ended up fudging their data, even though they had a conglomerate or a brain trust of wonderkins working on the project. Final question. Tell your employees the firm is dying and they'll work harder. Well, this is a bit of a misnomer. You should absolutely not tell your employees their firm is dying just so they'll work harder, because they usually won't. But if your firm is in trouble, you absolutely should tell your employees, because usually the greatest capital expenditure for any business is human resources. And typically, if you tell your employees that your company is on the brink, some of them will self-select out of the company, and that will free up some immediate revenue so that you can keep your company running just a little bit longer. The other thing that it will do is it might spark imaginative ideas. For example, Kentucky Fried Chicken was actually started on a whim because its proprietor, Colonel Sanders, really couldn't come up with any ideas until one of his secretaries suggested, "Well, I've never seen a chicken stand that wasn't doing good business." And 40 or 50 years later, it's an institution, and an international institution. So whether you realize it or not, we've been answering questions related to persuasion and ethics. And this goes all the way back to one of our inaugural lectures. In Peter Hadriansky, Sarah Slomsky, and Jamie Paterka's How Toxic Employees Get Their Way, the authors write, toxic employees, embodied by manipulation, present problems for any company, supervisor, and fellow employee. Learning how those high on the dark triad traits behave at work may permit preventative measures to be taken, or at least an understanding of what to expect from them. So how do they define a manipulative employee? In the second paragraph they continue, a manipulative bully is preoccupied with image, particularly their own. They want to be viewed as highly competent and successful, selfless and noble, a true leader who only wants what is best for the company and the people who work there. But the reality, however, is vastly different. If you see through the mask, a disturbing truth appears. They're scheming and deceitful, driven by an obsessive desire for power, prestige, and/or money. My guess is if you could probably share with me or your fellow student peers an instance that you've observed from this in your own work or school environment. So what are we dealing with here? And how do toxic employees or manipulative bullies often accede so high to their goals? Well, today we're going to talk about something that's mentioned in detail in your chapter. That is logical fallacies, which we'll define as any deficiency or contradiction in argumentation. So that does not preclude that the propositions, the ideas, or the arguments that they support are necessarily wrong. In fact, some well-known fallacies are regarded as valid arguments. A better way to describe what a logical fallacy is by using this illustration. You probably had a mathematics course at some time in your life, and you got the answer right, even though you got the question wrong because you didn't solve the problem in the correct way. A logical fallacy is a lot like that. If you think of our arguments in a mathematical formula, a logical fallacy is either jumping to the wrong conclusion with the right facts, or using poor facts to jump to a correct conclusion. Regardless, it ends up making bad arguments look good and good arguments look bad, which is why we should identify them and lance them from our own propositions, and be on the defense against them in regards to others' arguments. So we're going to talk about the top 10 logical fallacies that you're likely to encounter in either others' arguments or that you'll have to remove from your own. And the first is begging the question. Now, begging the question is often used incorrectly in daily speech. By begging the question, we don't mean compelling a question, as in a question must be asked. Begging the question presumes that you've already answered the question before you've asked it. In other words, it's a argument that assumes its evidence as a part of the argument itself. So if you've ever heard somebody say something like, "Hey, have you stopped beating your spouse?" That's a loaded question or a begged question because it presumes that you have beat your spouse or your significant other. If you've ever been asked, "Have you stopped strangling kittens?" Again, it presumes kitten strangling in the question. So a better way to describe a begged question is a loaded question or an inference. For example, if your spouse or your significant other or your bae or your whoever has ever said something to you like, "Hey, why do you always disagree with me?" Well, then you know that there's no correct response to that statement. Because if you agree with them, you're agreeing that you always disagree with them, and if you disagree with them, you're essentially proving their point. That's why begged questions should be removed from all of our arguments, because it obscures free flow debate. So, let's take a moment for a PSA, folks, and learn the deadly facts about water. Did you know that water can be chemically synthesized by burning rocket fuel? You wouldn't want to put rocket fuel in your body, so why would you want to put water in it? 100% of all serial killers and drug dealers have admitted to drinking water. And in fact, 100% of people exposed to water will die. In fact, I just learned that 100% of people that are exposed to oxygen also die. So I think we've capitalized on the secret to a long and healthful life. Never drink water, and don't breathe. If you knew those two things, then you should avoid these very deadly facts. Well, of course, those are very, very silly observations, because they're based on a logical fallacy. A logical fallacy called the argument of the excluded middle. Sometimes this is dubbed by its Latin phrase, the non sequitur, which literally translated means it does not follow. So in order to understand what an argument of excluded middle is, we have to understand what a good argument is. So good arguments have a few characteristics or traits. Number one, they have a premise and a conclusion. In other words, they have what I think is right and why I know I'm right. And then they have causes, the things that lead me to what I think is right to how I know I'm right. And usually non sequiturs are mixing those causes. In other words, they've been surgically removed or curated out of the argument in order to get an audience to leap to outlandish conclusions. For example, you might know that during the 1950s and early 1960s, it was illegal for anyone of an LGBT persuasion to be allowed on security grounds in the United States. In other words, they couldn't work for organizations like the FBI or the CIA, because there was statistical data that revealed that people that had an LGBT background were 3 times more likely to be blackmailed by a foreign power or a foreign enemy than people that were quote-unquote straight. But of course, what's missing from that equation is the cause, because if you're an LGBT person, and it's illegal for you to have a job on security grounds, what do you think is probably the most likely reason you would be blackmailed by a foreign power? Well, likely it's probably your sexual preferences, which means that if you just don't make it illegal to be LGBT on security grounds, you'll probably dash those statistics. But if you remove those causes, it looks like LGBT people are less trustworthy than their heterosexual counterparts. Another. In the 2008 general presidential election, there was a political ad that ran, John McCain. John McCain doesn't answer his own phone, and John McCain doesn't answer his own email or drive his own car, because John McCain is out of touch with the youth of America. Now again, just like we said whenever we defined what a logical fallacy is, John McCain may or may not be out of touch with the youth of America while he was still serving as a senator of the United States. But he wasn't out of touch with the United States youth because he didn't answer his own email or drive his own car. John McCain had his arms and back broken in over 19 different places while he was a prisoner in an internment camp during the Vietnam conflict. But if you remove that simple cause from the equation, it looked like John McCain was the "Hey you kids get off my lawn" candidate in the 2000 presidential election. We should always be afraid, or at least vigilant, against the removal of causes in arguments, because typically they're removed for a very special reason, and that's often to get us to believe something that's not exactly true if we had all the facts. All right, folks. Now, let's talk about something called an appeal to the public. An appeal to the public, the argumentum ad populum, literally translated, simply means that we're appealing to either a certain percentage of our audience or a large group of our audience in order to make our point. One reason we do this is called the bandwagon approach. In other words, we say that because the majority of people agree with us, we must be right. After all, majority of people own PCs and not apples. Majority of people eat at this restaurant instead of that restaurant, so that must mean that McDonald's is more healthy than Subway, or that Dells are better operating systems than Apples, even though the facts actually mete out quite the difference. We should know that at one time most people believed things like the world is flat, which means that just because a majority of individuals believe something doesn't necessarily mean it's true. Another permutation of the argument ad populum is the patriot approach. This is sometimes called draping yourself in the flag. It essentially is a wacky Mad Lib. You say, you're not a real blank unless you agree with me, and you fill in anything in that blank that you think is going to manipulate your audience. You're not a real American, hence the patriotic approach, unless you agree with me. You're not a real Christian, or Hindu, or Muslim, unless you agree with me. Or you're not even a real Star Trek fan, or Marvel Cinematic Universe fan, unless you agree with me, or buy this product, or vote for this candidate, etc., etc. And related to that is something called the snob approach. The snob approach says, you should agree with me because all the best people agree with me, and you get to define best in whatever way you like to manipulate your audience. The best can be the most intelligent, the most attractive, the most accomplished, because nobody wants to be ugly, poor, and failures, right? So essentially you're creating a dichotomy in your argument. Tell you what, let's look at an advertisement, because advertisements are often full of these three types of arguments, and see which argument to the population is most likely to be used.
Please pass the all fruit.
Pass the Polar all fruit.
Pass the Polar all fruit.
Would you please pass Janet?
Polar all fruit is real fruit, sweetened only with fruit juice. You'll call it delicious, you'll call it remarkable, but please don't dare call it jelly. Polar all fruit, the spread of fruit.
Alright, so what did we just see there? Probably what we saw was something akin to an argument of snob approach, because all the best people like Palantir Allfruit. Nobody wants to be a hick from the sticks, right? Alright, let's switch gears just a little bit. Do you know what closing a cascade circle-back loop is? You don't? Well, that's clearly just talking to your supervisor or manager. That's what that means. How about this one? Accelerated emergence of high maturity behaviors. Accelerated emergence of high maturity behaviors. That just means you're doing better at your job. How about this one? Spontaneous, energetic, disassembly. Huh? That's a nuclear meltdown. But if you read it a certain way, spontaneous, energetic, disassembly, that almost sounds like breaking a piñata or cleaning up really fast because your parents got home before the party was over. Well, all of these are examples of a logical fallacy that are otherwise dubbed doublespeak. So, what is doublespeak? Well, George Orwell, the author of 1984 and Animal Farm, is the first person to coin this phrase in the 20th century. He wrote in Politics and the English Language that at our time it is broadly true that political writing is bad writing. Where it is not true, it will generally be found that the writer is some kind of rebel, expressing his private opinions and not a party line. He continues at the bottom. A speaker who uses that kind of phraseology has gone some distance towards turning himself into a machine. The appropriate noises are coming out of his larynx, but his brain is not involved as it would be if he were choosing his words for himself. If the speech he is making is one that he is accustomed to make over and over again, he may be almost unconscious of what he is saying. And this reduced state of consciousness, if not indispensable, is at any rate favorable to indefensible conformity. In other words, what George Orwell is saying is that doublespeak allows us to not think closely about what we're saying, especially when what we have to say is fairly horrible or abhorrent. So, doublespeak is when we alter meaning with phrasing. Often it's often harsh or controversial for ideas, showing you the worst doublespeak right in front of you, right? There's nothing fun about that size. It's small, it's not as good, etc., right? But we often use things like doublespeak to soften especially radical ideas or offensive ideas. For example, there used to be a phrase in military combat called shell shock. It's when you were so afraid or anxious about either having to take someone's life or having to have your own life taken that you became shocked by shells. By the World War II, this phrase had come to be dubbed battle fatigue. Notice that we've doubled the amount of syllables, and we've also softened the meaning behind shock, shell shock, right? Battle fatigue. It almost sounds like you want to take a nap because you don't quite feel like fighting today. Today, we have a 14-syllable hyphenated phrase for that post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, the disorder has become so prevalent in our society that we've just started calling it PTSD. Now, the problem is that eventually people understand what PTSD means. So we have to keep changing and altering the phrasing because we want to soften the meaning behind it. Take a term like collateral damage. Collateral damage, or friendly fire, is what's done to not enemy combatants, but to our own combatants or to enemy civilians. It used to be called civilian casualties. Because the dirty little secret is that for many, many years, perhaps hundreds, one of the main ways that you won military engagements is through civilian casualties. You killed so many of your enemy's civilians that eventually the civilians told their leaders, we don't care who wins, we just want to stop dying. The problem is that if we measured the victories of enemy combatants in World War II, Adolf Hitler probably would have won. He killed over 6 million civilians, and we know a couple of things. We know that Adolf Hitler is bad, We know that fun size is not fun, and we know that there's no way we would let Hitler win World War II. So we've started calling it collateral damage since that time. But here's the problem. It's very difficult since that time, since World War II, to define how wars are won. So in instances like the Vietnam conflict, or the war in Iraq or Afghanistan, we've had increasingly difficult times defining whether or not we've achieved victory, and on what grounds. Okay, folks, here's just a little bit of a PSA for those that are of a religious persuasion. This is an article about the Church of Batman. Church of Batman. I'm here to spread the word of our Lord Bruce Wayne and Batmanism, said Paul. It's a minority religion in the UK, but it's very popular in America and Japan. I think that without preaching the message, it's just not going to get through. So just like mainstream religions, he continues, Batmanism has its own set of ceremonies and rituals. When Paul was 8, he had his bat mitzvah, which recreates the agonizing moment when a young Bruce Wayne saw his parents gunned down. There's one time when our Lord has fallen. He's never been killed, which shows his immortality, but he was broken. Batmanists must dedicate their lives to pious training and endless crime-fighting, train, and train again. That's our approach, said Paul. If you're not training, you're not emulating him. How are you going to protect the streets with a flabby stomach and man boobs? You need to be at the gym 24/7 or on the streets. Batman never slept. Have you ever seen Batman sleeping? Of course not. So, what if we wanted to worship Batman? What if I said to you that the only way to pass this course is to start dressing up like Batman? You wear your underpants outside your regular pants, and you start punching people in the face if they do bad things. Why? Because Batman spoke to me in a vision. He said it, I read it, and that's the end of it. Well, I wouldn't actually be sharing an argument with you. I'd be sharing a fallacy, and that fallacy is called an appeal to authority. This is when we propose evidence as our argument, with the absence of a logical proof. In other words, you can't disprove that Batman didn't come to me in a vision. But that yields the source of this particular fallacy, because what it conclusively demonstrates is, I can't prove to you that it happened. Instead, I'm compelling you to prove that it didn't happen. And this relates to another logical fallacy called small sample statistics. Small sample statistics is really just an argument with the absence of comprehensive data. So if you ever said before something like, you should never date someone from New York. I dated one person from New York. They're all jerks and they talk too fast. People from New York are jerks and they talk too fast. That's when you're substituting an anecdote for a proposition. That's why they're called small sample statistics, because you're substituting your anecdote for a larger and more credible statistic. All right, folks. Another logical fallacy is called public alarm. Public alarm is when we appeal to the consequences instead of logic. You can't vote for that candidate, because if you vote for that candidate, then dogs and cats will start living together in sin, and blood will rain down from the sky, and people will turn into zombies. So notice that I didn't actually give you any reasons why you shouldn't vote for that candidate. All I did was essentially try to emotionally blackmail you. And a public alarm is actually a type of legal adjudication. It's when you object in a court of law to your opponent's final statement. So if their final statement is, we can't put this person back on a street because it'll set a dangerous precedent, they're ignoring all the facts of the case or the actual arguments in a larger proposition. That's why we say it's emotionally blackmailing its audience. An appeal to ignorance is related to an appeal to authority. But instead of just saying, somebody told me, and because they told me, it must be true, an appeal to ignorance is a claim that's resolved via the absence of a dispute. So if you say something like, there's a ghost in my grandma's closet, and then someone says, I don't know if that's true, and you say, prove that there's not, you're guilty of an appeal to ignorance. Why? Because it does not seek a competing argument. Remember, All propositions or arguments must seek competition. That's what it means to be a part of a larger academic conversation. One of our last logical fallacies is the straw man. A straw man argument is when you overstate, exaggerate, or oversimplify your opponent. In other words, you extrapolate the absolute worst ideas related to their proposition and then hold that up as if it's the person's argument themselves instead of just a version of their argument. In other words, you erect the argument exclusively for destruction, hence the phrase straw man. Finally, the ad hominem. The ad hominem is a phrase that literally means to the person. So, for example, Rush Limbaugh is a big fat racist, drug-addicted, lying, hypocritical, misogynistic idiot. Well, let's say all of those things are absolutely true. Big and fat. Yeah, he's had a problem with yo-yo weight his entire life. Racist? Well, I do believe he'd made a comment about somebody having a bone in their nose in the early 1970s. Drug-addicted? Yeah, he's actually checked himself into a clinic at one time or another because of an opioid addiction. Lying, hypocritical idiot? Yeah, you be the judge. Misogynistic? Yeah, I think he's on his third or fourth wife. He has bad luck with women, let's say. But even if all of those things are 1,000% true, does that make what Rush Limbaugh says wrong? No, and that's why it's an ad hominem argument. Because whatever you think about what Rush Limbaugh says, or who he is, you can't argue towards the person. You can't just make fun of the person and substitute that as a negation of their arguments or propositions. All right, folks, that's all we've got time for today. Remember, if you have any trouble with the discussion journal entries related to either of your chapters, feel free to reach out to me via email at your very first opportunity. In the meantime, take care.